The only piece of forensic evidence we found in the restaurant to suggest trauma was a tooth lodged in the sink. That type of response is not the type of response you would suspect from somebody who
was not guilty, who's not involved in it. All right. We're going to get to all of that in just a moment. But first, I want you to know how grateful I am for today's podcast sponsor, my friends at FitAF Nutrition. They are Eastern Pennsylvania's leading meal prep company. FitAF offers meals of multiple sizes for people with various health goals. And you know what I love about this company? They use high-quality ingredients like grass-fed meats, wild fish, and locally harvested produce. And all right, for you parents on the go, they even offer family meals. Go to fitafnutrition.com, place your order by Thursday at midnight, and get fresh, prepared meals delivered right to your door on Sunday. Use code RLECKY at checkout and get 20% off your first order. Here we go, buddy.
It's the Ryan Leckey Show.
Welcome back to the Ryan Leckey Show. This is part 2 of one of the most high-profile cold case files that existed in northeastern Pennsylvania. Robert Barron, a business owner in Old Forge, Pennsylvania, who went missing in January 2017. The case went cold for years, but thanks to cell phone technology, volunteers, amazing investigators, they eventually found Robert Barron's body. But then there were so many other questions exactly how he ended up dead. We do know, thanks to District Attorney Mark Powell of Lackawanna County, all the cell phone technology data led you to his body in 2023. But this episode is focused now on the day of the arrest and what played out in the courtroom. So you have a suspect in the mix, Justin Schuback, who you're about to arrest. Walk me through the timeline when that played out and how we got this to trial.
Yeah. So law enforcement does a pretty good job to ensure safety when making an arrest like this because you never know what to expect. So they had their SWAT vehicles ready. You prepare for war, you're praying for peace, and they had everybody lined up, and they did a very early entry into his home. He complied with the arrest, and fortunately, he was taken into custody without incident. Now, here's a guy who has gotten away with murder for 6 years, and as time went on, he became more and more arrogant that he would get away with murder and wouldn't get caught, and he had indicated a lot of theories as to why he wasn't the suspect, and that he simply was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So he actually spoke a little bit with our investigators and kind of gave the same old story that, just wasn't him, tried to talk his way around some of the facts.
But as mentioned in part 1 of the podcast, if you missed it, you have cell phone technology that is up to date, new data you had in 2023 versus what you had in 2017. You had a lot of new evidence coming into play.
Yeah.
And what was his initial reaction, though? Was it shock, stunned?
Because
it was 6 years later.
It was denial and the same, it wasn't me, you guys have the wrong person type of, response. But what investigators do then is to confront someone with very hard evidence in order to see if that gets them to talk or rethink their position. So investigators who were exceptionally skilled at this started to try to convince him that, listen, we know you're not being forthright. We have evidence against you. They talked about the cell tower information. I don't think he had much of a reaction with that. They confronted him with the DNA evidence that they retrieved in the car, and his response was, how could there be DNA and evidence in the car if you wiped it up? So that type of response is not the type of response you would suspect from somebody who didn't have anything involved.
Who's not involved in it. But ultimately, the DNA evidence you're talking about was of the victim.
No. So in the restaurant, we had 0 DNA of the defendant. Initially, we had 0 DNA evidence from the defendant in the car, but part of our investigative process of redoing things was to take a second shot at getting DNA. And so we sent another investigative team out in order to get DNA. And DNA comes in all samples, right? So, blood or body fluid was usually typically your strongest DNA.
Hair.
Hair can be, but it has to be a hair with a root, not just a piece of hair. And so we had some hair that didn't contain a root, and that ended up not being fruitful. But there's also touch DNA. So just the perspiration on your hand or the touch of DNA can also be traceable. The state police lab was unable to make a conclusive determination based upon the touch DNA, but on the steering wheel of the vehicle, but they knew there was a mixture. And so they recommended a different forensic scientist who specialized in mixture DNA. And that individual, Bill Allen, was able to take the new findings of DNA and determine that in a statistic probability that there was not only Mr. Barron's DNA in the vehicle, but also Justin Schubeck's DNA on the steering wheel and on the grab handle of the driver's door. We knew there was blood of Barron on the passenger side. That's how he was transported. But now we had evidence of Schubeck being in the car. And one of the great investigative techniques is before we did that search, we sent a detective and trooper out to interview Schubeck. So before the search, before any of the hoopla that we knew we had set, because we had set this for months, they knocked on his door and engaged him in conversation. Of course, he was first defensive, didn't want to speak, but they developed a ploy to say, listen, we're not looking at you as a suspect. We're looking at another individual. They were actually trying to fictitiously blame Bobby Jr. in order to gain the confidence of Schubeck to talk. And it was successful. Their sole purpose was to establish whether or not Schubeck was ever in the vehicle. So they did an hour conversation, wired, recorded, talking to him about where he was, that they believed him, they didn't think he had anything to do with the crime. And in the meantime, at this stage, he's our sole suspect. Everybody else has been ruled out. And the sole purpose is just to see whether he was ever in that car before.
And the car is owned by?
So the car was owned, actually, Robert Barron Sr. was borrowing the car from a dear friend because he was in the process of buying a car. So we had that individual's DNA, but that he was never a suspect. But the question, and it was only about a 2 or 3 month time frame that we were dealing with, that Robert Sr. would have been borrowing this car. But we wanted to establish whether the defendant was ever in the car or not. So during this hour conversation, wired, they talked to him about everything under the sun to gain his confidence. The fact that they thought Bobby Jr. was the real suspect here, and Bobby Jr. is the one who would have committed this crime. Of course, Schubeck dove all in and agreed that it had to be Bobby Jr. And in fact, he thought Bobby Jr. set him up to be near the restaurant, and that's why his name was circulated. And then they asked him, had you ever been in that car? And he said, no, I was never in that car. Bingo. That's all they really wanted to get, that 2-line word that he later confirmed again in a post-arrest interview, that he was never in that car. Well, of course, we knew he was in the car because we had his DNA in the car. So that's just, you can rely on science, and the science certainly helped, but that's just good old-fashioned police work. Roll up your sleeve, knock on a door, get someone to talk, and get incriminating evidence by just doing a very good interrogation. So that was another critical piece of evidence.
And the timeline now, we're still in 2023 when you guys make the arrest of Justin Schubeck. Walk me through what happened, because he never really confessed to anything during your interrogation, right?
Correct.
And at what point did he lawyer up? And then the other rumors and his defense started focusing on the possibility that it had to be somebody other than Schubeck.
Yeah, so I wear 2 hats during the whole process. One, you're kind of the leader of the band trying to orchestrate many of these talented investigators. And it's not just me, it's a team effort. I have a lot of great prosecutors who assist. And you're orchestrating their investigation. Candidly, they're better investigators, right? It was their idea to go out and interview Schubeck before the search in order to gain that information. But you're piecing it together, and you're giving suggestions where you can, and you're approving search warrants, and you're approving the wire. You're doing the lawyerly stuff. But once an arrest is made, they line it up for you. You got to carry it over the finish line. And that's where you wear the other hat of being the prosecutor or trial lawyer. And so from March 2023 until May of 2024, it was all lawyer work. I mean, that was the getting through preliminary hearings, the motion practice, responding to briefs, filing our own motions. Very labor-intensive work, but personally what I love to do. I mean, it's what I do. And then ultimately trying the case successfully. So, I mean, for me, that's the fun part. A lot of pressure, a lot of stress. You know, you're expected to win, but you know, you're dealing with 12 jurors. It only takes one in order to get a not guilty or a hung jury. And your standard is proof beyond all reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard. And you have someone of equal talent on the other side defending this guy, doing everything they can to raise that reasonable doubt.
How tough was it, though, to find an impartial jury in this area? Because it was one of the most high-profile cold cases for a while because, right, 2017 happens, and then it's not until, I think, 6 years later, the arrest is made, but everybody still talked about it. So how difficult was that?
Interesting. So we brought in a pretty substantial panel to narrow it down to 12 and 4 alternates. It's not that someone never heard of the case, but believe it or not, from that panel, there were probably 10 or 15% of the folks who had no idea what Robert Barron was or Gigerelli's Pizza was or heard anything about the murder. Now, you're talking about folks from all over the county as far as Carbondale or Forest City, but there was a group that had no idea. And then but the real question is, despite having heard something about the case, would you keep an open mind? Would you be fair? Is there anything that you heard that would prejudice you or cause you to be biased or have an opinion one way or the other? So clearly those folks, and there were several, were eliminated for cause. But through that process of deselection, right, it's you don't pick your jury, you're trying to take people off a jury who can't be fair for a variety of reasons, and that would mean that, you know, they had some emotional tie to either Schubeck or the Barron family. We had people who knew the defendant, and we had people who were involved enough in the investigation from an outside source that they said they just couldn't be fair. They had a preconceived idea that someone or Schubeck had committed that. Those were all eliminated from the jury. So remarkably, we were able to pick a jury within a day, which did move at a pretty quick pace. In fact, the whole case ran rather efficiently.
And give people the timeline. So how many jurors do we have, and when did we start?
Yeah, so we started on a Monday, picked a jury in that first day, and actually, at my insistence, were able to open late in the day. The judge had given us the option to start the next day, but we had witnesses lined up, and I thought, with the jury having sat through that whole process of voir dire and jury selection, that they wanted to hear a little bit about the case. So I had asked if we had time to allow us to open. The judge accommodated us. So we were able to open at the end of the day and probably wrapped up court about 5:30 p.m. on that first day without taking a lunch for the lawyers. So it was a rigorous day. And then we moved right into the factual testimony the next day. And that continued through a week and a half of really full days, never a loss for a witness, and bringing the case forward. When we shifted
who are
into the next
some
week,
of your key witnesses, I want to ask, in your
so we
for the
had
prosecution?
fact witnesses and expert witnesses. So the fact witnesses, so you can't present the family who experienced the loss, right? That's prejudicial. In a civil case, that's all very important. At sentencing, that will all be very important. But in trial, putting the daughters on who lost their dad and the emotional component of it is not allowed. In fact, even when they became emotional during certain aspects of the trial, there were some thoughts of having them step out of the courtroom. And when the remains were found, they did step out of the courtroom in order to not show that emotion to in any way prejudice the jury or influence the jury. But you have fact witnesses. But all the fact witnesses, many of them, while credible, were individuals who were admitted drug users and people who violated crimes I think they all testified credibly, but there was a lot to cross-examine them on, including some of their own wrongdoing. And then we had expert witnesses, and the expert witnesses would have been that forensic team. So we had the two DNA experts. We had the anthropologist who put the bones together.
From Mercyhurst.
Right. And then we had the FBI agent to do the range to tower. And then we had cops. So the cops talked a little bit about their investigative role and then doing the searches. So those were kind of the three areas of witnesses that we used. So there was a mixture of fact, experts, and cops.
What blew your mind, I guess, from the defense side, right? Because from what I understand, Justin Schuback's defense just continually to focus on the possibility that someone other than Schuback was involved in this. And what kind of holes did they punch in your case?
I think so Bernie Brown was the defense attorney. He is currently the public defender who defends all homicide cases. He's a very formidable opponent. He did a very good job with the evidence that he had, and he poked holes. And when you're defending a case, and I did defense work for 27 years before becoming a DA, I'm intimately familiar with what needs to be done in order to raise that reasonable doubt. He didn't miss anything. He absolutely exposed any weaknesses in the case, and we did have weaknesses in the case. I mean, there weren't any witnesses to the crime. The only person who truly knew what happened, who was living, who survived, was the defendant. We didn't have all the body parts, so forensically we couldn't show what happened to the skull or what happened to his body. So he focused, and then it was difficult to believe, and there's still conspiracy theories out there to this day, that any one individual could have committed this crime. So how could one individual commit the crime, clean up the scene, and dispose of the body? And those are all valid points. I firmly believe that we proved those successfully, that the jury made the right decision. But Attorney Brown did a very effective job exposing those weaknesses. And one of the main suspects in all of this, because he admittedly lied to us from the beginning about his own drug use, was Bobby Jr., the own son, who was not forthright with law enforcement, was covering up his drug use, covering up his drug transactions, covering up some of the cash that he had. So
and
we
this
had
is the victim's son.
The victim's son. So we had, a family member who was highly suspicious and also guilt-ridden. Now, when I say guilt-ridden, that doesn't mean he harmed his father. But it was because of the folks he was hanging out with that led Schuback to commit this robbery and murder. And as a result of that, I think Bobby Jr. feels responsible for the crime, even though he's not legally responsible for the crime. He loved his dad. His dad was his best friend. His dad supported him financially. His dad was the source for running that business that has not opened since the day of the murder. the dad was everything to that family. They, raised the two daughters, financially supported the whole family. Bobby Jr. worked side by side with them for many years in the restaurant. So it was a very difficult emotional time for the family. Maria and Bobby Sr., I think, had begun dating when Maria was 15 years old. So they're sweethearts from the time they were children. So it was a very, very difficult loss for them to experience, and a loss that will never be filled, a loss they experienced to this day. But as a result of that, Bobby Jr. felt responsible, even though not culpable, responsible for kind of bringing this bad element into his father's world.
During the trial, what was exposed as far as how Robert Barron Sr., how he was murdered? Was there a murder weapon you found?
Yeah, so we really couldn't prove how. So I tried to focus on what and who, and tried to explain that it really didn't matter how, because we knew what happened.
And is that because you couldn't find the skull, as you mentioned in part one of this podcast?
Yeah, we had bones that were eaten by animals. We had no forensic evidence of trauma. Mm-hmm. We had nothing. We had blood spatter that would suggest a violent bloodbath occurred in the restaurant, but no one witnessed the incident, and there was substantial cleanup. So the hurdle was based on those facts. How do you prove specific intent? So in order to prove murder in the first degree, which is ultimately what the jury concluded, you have to prove that someone had premeditated specific intent to kill. And that was a hurdle based upon the lack of evidence. On the other hand, circumstantially, it all fit. We knew that there was blood all over the place. So this just wasn't like one punch and you're down, or one stabbing, or a shotgun shell, right? There was blood all over that restaurant. So there was a brutal physical altercation. The only piece of forensic evidence we found in the restaurant to suggest trauma was a tooth lodged in the sink. So Mr. Barron's tooth, intact, root and all, was in the sink. Well, that would suggest that something very violent happened if your tooth comes out at the root. That just doesn't happen every day. So that would mean that something very, very traumatic happens. And we did have an interesting piece of evidence that wasn't very persuasive, but we also had a jailhouse confession to Carlos Perez, who testified. Carlos Perez has a criminal record a mile long. He was charged with burglary and happened to be a cellmate of Schuback, and indicated that Schuback confessed to him. Now, we know from our investigative techniques that there were a lot of things that Perez said to us that he would not have been able to obtain from anybody else but Schuback. So we found him to be credible, but we knew a jury would never find him to be credible because of all the baggage that he had coming into court. So we couldn't put a lot of weight in to what Perez said, because that confession was really suspect to a lot of suspicion, that he was making it up in order to cut his own deal, to get charges dropped. And this is an individual who committed burglary in the past. He had crimes that affected his veracity or truthfulness, all of which is legitimately can be used against him to determine his credibility. So we knew we had to soft play that and try to take the sting out of a lot of it, and we weren't going to rest basically on what Mr. Perez had to say, but it was very helpful to us, And what Perez said, Schubeck said, is that he hit him with a metal object, and that made sense with what we knew, the blood spatter, the missing tooth. It just kind of all fit. So we used it. I didn't put a lot of weight into it. We didn't argue it, over-argue it, or ask the jury to rely on it exclusively, but just to consider it. And candidly, would someone confess to something they didn't do, and evaluate Perez's credibility based upon the fact that he knew some things that he couldn't just read in the paper. I don't know how persuasive he was. I mean, he certainly wasn't the best witness. He was nervous. He was couldn't really answer a lot of the questions about his self-motivation for testifying. The defense attorney chewed him up and spit him out, to be honest. So I'm not sure if that carried a lot of weight overall, but it was a piece of the puzzle that fit, and it did answer some of our questions. And for areas outside what the jury would have heard, there are a lot of things that made sense to us from an investigative standpoint that seemed to fit. So that's trying a case, prosecuting a case is a lot of art. It's a little bit of science, but it's a lot of art. And those are the nuances that as prosecutors you try to present in a persuasive fashion, anticipate your weaknesses, try to overcome those, and present credible evidence, right? If you're not, if I oversold Perez and said, he confessed and you need to believe Perez, I couldn't say that credibly and expect a jury to believe me. So we knew that was not a strong piece of evidence. You need to present that softly for their consideration. Hey, listen, you got to decide whether he's credible or not. Here's why we believe he's credible, but you need to make that decision. But regardless of what he said, here's the evidence that is beyond dispute, and that would be the DNA, the phone to tower, some of the testimony, right? So the defendant's girlfriend, 19 years old, living with him, talked about him coming into the bedroom of their house through a window all muddy at 3 a.m. Then Schubeck leaves at 6 a.m. after doing some drugs and returns at 9 a.m. the next day, muddy again. Those facts suggest he was up to something. And when you add that all up cumulatively, what are the chances that this particular individual is in all these places at a period of time from 11 to 3 in the morning, just so happens a murder takes place, and he has money to buy drugs immediately after. So I think the jury got it right. The jury was fabulous. They were probably the most attentive jury I've ever had the experience of working with, but I find most jurors to be attentive and take their job very seriously, but they were very, very responsible. They asked very good questions, and the questions led me to believe they were struggling with a specific intent issue, which ultimately they resolved based upon the forensic evidence.
Justin Schubeck, he never testified.
He chose not to testify, correct, which is his right.
Okay. Is that normal in these type of trials?
I think a lot depends on the defense attorney. I've never, in 27 years, put a defendant on the stand. If a defendant insisted on going on the stand, I would, but I've always tried to talk them out of it, because from the defense standpoint, you're trying to poke holes, and when you put your client on the stand, the focus goes to the client. If the client is credible, you have a chance of winning. If the client is not credible, all that good work you've done as a defense attorney goes down the drain, and they make a decision based upon how that defendant testifies. So I've always chosen not to put my client on the stand, especially if I could prove it or raise an issue through somebody else. I'm not sure what Schubeck or the attorney's tactic was, but they ultimately chose not to put him on the stand. But many lawyers do put people on the stand. You have an absolute right not to testify, and it can't be held against you.
And Mark, was there any knowledge bombs during this trial before it was given to the jurors? Anything that dropped during this trial that you're like,
yeah,
this is it?
So if you prepare a case, there should not be any surprises. From the prosecution end, there were no surprises. Certainly, evidence went in better than others in certain areas and not quite as well in other areas. That's just natural. Perez, who I found to be very credible, I thought got destroyed on the witness stand. Bobby Jr., who I was scared to death to put on the witness stand, I thought did fairly well. Not great, but fairly well, because he just spoke from the heart, and he was honest. He was honest about his addiction. He was honest about feeling responsible for the murder, and he was honest about the loss that he had experienced with his father. Now, I don't know what a jury's reaction to Bobby Jr. was. I don't think they liked him. They weren't putting him on a pedestal. But, a juror can conclude he's dishonest and a drug user and is guilty of certain crimes, but I don't believe anyone ever thought he was guilty of murder. And that was my concern, that the defense could successfully point to somebody else that the cops missed because of putting blinders on, and particularly the family surrounding the support of their blood, their own brother and son, to try to defend him in any wrongdoing. And I don't think that was the case. I don't think Bobby Jr. was involved in the crime. But there's not a lot of love lost with my detectives and Bobby Jr. because he certainly misled them. I think, from my perspective, having done criminal defense work, and believe me, I value integrity and honesty more than most things in life, particularly when you make your living on that in a courtroom. But I think I'm a little more understanding when drug users lie, that's kind of how they survive. And when he's lying about his drug use, I was less critical about that. I mean, I wasn't happy about it. We were there to solve a murder. It distracted us. It was a problem. But I understand why he was covering up his own drug use. And a little more understanding as to the role that played in the investigation.
So after the prosecution does its thing, defense, everything is kind of handed to the jury now to make the decision. How long did it take? And were they all on the same page?
So they took their time. They deliberated a whole afternoon, broke that evening, and then came back and deliberated a whole morning and into the afternoon. As a general rule, a quick verdict is good for the prosecution, and a longer deliberations usually means there are some holdouts, and that's not a good sign for the prosecution. And again, they only need one. They need one juror to not be unanimous in order to either get a hung jury and cause a loss, or at least the risk of having to try the case again if it's a hung jury, or they can acquit. I found the jury to be exceptionally thorough. So, we were optimistic, but when they asked questions, they were good questions. They wanted to see the crime scene photos again. They wanted to see the range to tower information again. They wanted a definition of specific intent again. Those are good questions. That jury was working hard. And their response during the whole trial was a really fresh response. I've had jurors close their eyes and act as though they're not paying attention, even though, candidly, some of those jurors are very engaged and just listening in a different way. These jurors were engaged from the moment the trial started to the moment the trial ended. A week and a half trial, that asks a lot of a citizen to give up their life for that period of time, to to get involved in a case, but I have nothing but praise for that jury. They really took a responsible look at this case, and I believe made the right decision and brought closure for the Barron family, who had been through so very much.
Talk to me about overall. What was the timeline that this was at trial?
So actually, trial day is a week and a half, but preparation,
Like
a
7
month
years,
before
right?
that, yeah, and 6 years of investigative work. Those, when you love what you're doing, it's not work, but 16-hour days wear you down. And good night's sleep for about 4 hours because your mind is racing. So you're popping out of bed. The only thing you're thinking of is that case. And you have your, business as usual. You have a lot of other cases. You have hundreds of other cases going on. But what I truly enjoy about being in trial is it allows you to be singular focused and concentrate on one case for a brief period of time. And as labor intensive as that is, it's somewhat liberating because you can delegate some of your other. Everybody understands you're in trial. Everybody, my family, goes away. Everybody knows you have a mission to accomplish, and they support you in that. So we have a support staff that kind of picked up the pieces. And again, I didn't try this alone. I had Sarah Varela as my co-counsel, who did a lot of the heavy lifting, an excellent trial lawyer. Dave Coyne assisted as a prosecutor. We had our investigative team. I mean, it is fully a team effort, and just it really does a few things. It reinforces the idea that the system works. It establishes that people who are in law enforcement do it for all the right reasons. They work tirelessly. They never gave up. I mean, never gave up on solving this case. The grit and tenacity that they had to revisit and do things and look at them again and be subject to criticism and just be stellar in their performance because it was the right thing to do is just remarkable. And then ultimately put it all together and testify, which isn't, you're familiar with that, I'm familiar with it, but, scientists are not good testifiers typically. So these expert witnesses who work in labs don't particularly enjoy getting on a witness stand and don't like being cross-examined and challenged on their opinions. It's not what they do every day. Cops, as fearless as they are running into a building with guns drawn, don't particularly like being on a witness stand and being subject to questioning of what they may have done and not done. And I understand that's appropriate, but it ain't easy. But boy, they just put their head up high, their shoulders back, and forge ahead. And I can't say enough about the folks who worked on this case. They just did a remarkable job.
And ultimately, what was Justin Schuback convicted of?
So he was convicted of first-degree murder, which is the highest level charge, as well as burglary and robbery. He's going to be sentenced July 19th.
Of 2024.
Of 2024, and he will receive a life sentence, automatic life sentence, based on the first-degree murder. So he will never get out of jail. And they are performing a pre-sentence investigation on him now to add additional sentencing time based upon the burglary and the robbery. And that will ensure, you hope this case is bulletproof. You hope it's not subject to an appeal or a reversal, and I truly don't believe any error occurred. But he will file, this case will live on for another 5 or 10 years with motions to both challenge the judge's rulings and then his own counsel. He'll file ineffective assistance of counsel claims. So while we believe we've reached closure, we will be fighting this battle for many, many years to come. And depending on what happens, if God forbid, something is reversed or overturned, those other sentences then impact the fact that he hopefully will remain in jail for the rest of his life for the crime that he committed.
When the conviction all happened, what did Robert Barron Sr.'s wife say to you?
they thanked us. Obviously, they know how hard we worked. They were completely vested in the case, right? They had opinions, and we didn't always align in our opinions, and sometimes. As a prosecutor, you have to rely on your expertise, having done this, rather than someone's reaction, although I certainly listen to family members and try to sympathize with what they're going through. But they were grateful. I don't think it heals or resolves the loss that they experienced, but it helps to bring some closure and allow them to move on. I mean, honestly, they've been living a torturous life for 6 years where they didn't even know where Robert Barron was. And they would see who they believed was the suspect walking freely in the supermarket, walking around town, becoming more and more arrogant every day that he's getting away with murder. And they had their frustration with our office because we couldn't share certain information with them. And I understand that. I appreciate that. I've always sympathized with them through the process. They loved their dad. They loved Robert Barron Sr., and they were never going to give up on trying to solve the murder. And I'm just very happy that we were able to ultimately deliver justice for them.
At the end of the day, like when all of this is wrapped, right? I think of part one of this podcast with you, and we talk about, there's the New York State dogs that were coming in to help. Months and months of analyzing data with the FBI, the work your office did for 6 years. I mean, what's a price tag on this? Like, this is an insane amount of work, years.
Yeah, I don't think I could quantify the amount, but I can tell you there was no resource spared. But on the other hand, we had a murderer on the loose. And that's what we do. So I think it's money well spent in order to provide security for people, to hold people accountable, to deter others from committing those crimes. But there was a very high price tag with the amount of resources that were invested in the prosecution of this case. No doubt.
Would you say what really just kind of solved this or helped get you to Robert Barron's body and get this to trial was the cell phone technology data and working with the FBI's expert to track exactly his location and narrowing it down into that field with the dogs, right, and saying, go here.
Yeah.
That was it?
No doubt the range to tower solved this case.
Wow. Anything as the district attorney of Lackawanna County, Mark, that you want to mention just regarding this? Anything I didn't ask you?
Every case is important. I could talk to you about dozens and dozens of cases and capture your attention because every case is important. Every case is tragic. Every family experiences a loss when someone is murdered. Mm-hmm. I'm particularly proud of this case because I inherited a case that was stagnant. I mean,
it's something that rocked the Old Forge community of Pennsylvania, and so many people in northeastern Pennsylvania. I mean, everybody talked about this. They paid attention. They had questions.
Yeah, and I grew up 2 miles away from where this happened. I used to go to Gigerelli's restaurant all the time, right? I didn't grow up in Old Forge, but it was in my backyard. So, it had an impact on everybody in that community. And it was important that someone did not get away for murder in a small town, a safe town, a good town with good people. So, I'm particularly proud that we were able to not only find the body, bring closure to the Barron family, but ultimately carry it over to the finish line and have a successful prosecution before a jury of 12 of his peers.
And I think it's safe to say a cold case. That was cold, I should say, for like 6 years. You guys never stopped working on it. And now, case closed.
Case closed, yeah. And with a great result.
Thanks again for your time. And thank you for being a part of another episode of The Ryan Leckey Show. I'll see you next time.